If you know me, you may know me as someone that enjoys the more competitive and try-hard bits of EU4. And if you don't know me, and this is my first video that you have seen, then I tend to enjoy the more competitive and try-hard bits of EU4. But I can enjoy the odd roleplay game here and there, especially in a single-player environment, or even do a try-hard run where I am trying to basically do retroactive roleplay as to why my nation is doing the weird things it is doing. In essence, a little bit of roleplay never hurts, and we have to admit, being in charge of an early modern period state conceptually is cool. So today I want to explore 5 additions to EU4 that will help with the more roleplay aspects of the game. However, while doing so, I want these features to follow 2 distinct speculations. They need to, number 1, not affect the actual gameplay. So no, I can't just say we need tuners missions for roleplay purposes, that's just asking for new content. And also 2, these things need to be ignorable if I am, for example, someone that doesn't care about them. With those stipulations met, the last thing we have to do before we get into the video is to get the usual things out of the way. A like on the video would be appreciated, and a subscription would be amazing if you haven't already. 20k is like right there. Anyway, enough self-shitting, let's get into the game. So here I've loaded into a pretty late game of 1763 as Revolutionary Career. I was doing the 10k dev run on this, which I ended up failing. The reason I've loaded into here is going to let me demonstrate a lot of the features I'm going to be talking about. And the first one we are going to be talking about is actually going to be a bit harder to demonstrate though with this run. What I mean by all of this rambling is I want some kind of history for generals. Basically, we only recently found out when they get hired and how old they are. And these guys can live to a pretty long time. I've had some 65-year-old generals still running around. And if you're playing a big game of EU4, you're doing a lot of fighting, a lot of sieging, a lot of things like that, these generals tend to end up doing quite a lot of things. I think it'll be really cool to have some kind of roleplay drop-down menu that will keep track of what each general has achieved during their life. Maybe as an option for when you get the pop-up that general has passed away in a camp or something. You can get some kind of breakdown on how many forts in total he's sieged over, how many enemy troops he's killed, how many of his own troops did he end up reinforcing throughout his career, how much attrition he took, maybe even in what provinces he campaigned in. Did he fight rebels? Did he fight other nations? There's a lot of really cool stuff that could be communicated with us, and it'll be some really cool stats to see as well. For example, to see on a general just how many rebels he's killed, for example, to see on a general how many AIs he's killed in the process, or even players, if you're looking at this from a multiplayer point of view. Just some kind of stat tracker on the general side, which again should be just ignorable. It should be just as an optional menu when that general dies. But I think it'd be really cool for especially big generals that you, for example, you roll a really, really good general, or you get some general of the, you get the 100th edition from the Joust event, and you want to see, okay, this general, he's really good, I've been fighting a lot with him, but how much did he actually fight? How much did he actually contribute? I think that's genuinely a pretty missing part of the game. Generals are quite impactful, but not from a roleplay perspective. They just kind of come and go and do their thing. With that, another person that's definitely very impactful within your nation is your monarch. And outside of some personality traits, you really don't get to see much of what they end up doing. There is a bit of a history breakdown, we'll get to the history breakdown in a bit, but at the death of a ruler, I think it would be really cool to see like a breakdown on what's changed in the country since they came over. Like, we started at X development, we ended on Y, what institutions the ruler embraced, maybe what was he focusing mill points, what did the ruler achieve? Was it a mostly peaceful rule? Did he declare many wars? Was he declared on? Did he defend the realm? How many men died in wars during his period? Did he enter a golden era? Like, so many other cool things that, in essence, things like how many golden eras you entered and how many wars you can track yourself. But in practice, I think it'd be really cool to see some kind of like summary, almost for lack of a better word, of what each ruler had done in his lifetime, because I think that's kind of lacking in this sense. There is a bit of a summary of what the ruler has done, and the way this is tracked is actually in the history file of your nation, which is where I'm going to be the next layer of my issue. First of all, it can begin before the actual game starts. You can get a bit of a history before 13, well, in this case, the ruler of your country between 1393 and 1398. But this looks at basically your ruler, and that's about it. Unfortunately, this tends to be very stupid before 1444, because even though they're coded in historically that you have these rulers, they also just are coded to have done absolutely nothing. So despite these rulers being literally mentioned, they're always known as the cautious because they did absolutely nothing in their reign. What is talked about, you do get a little bit of a history of each ruler individually. The problem is this is terrible for an actual play perspective. I mean, let's take a look at some of the brief Korean Ming War for the Mandate. Ended after 10 years, resulting in conquest. I think if a 10-year war is called brief, I think there's definitely some kind of breakdown in localization. The most decisive battle of the war was when 29,996 men, just call that 30k. Like, any historian's going to call that 30k. Having that level of precision is just stupid. led by the Korean general, suffered some losses attacking the 21,000. What losses? How many losses suffered? Who also lost most of their forces? Okay, so it's either lost most of their forces or they also took some of those losses. You also talk about, like, I made the decision to grant generalship to an estate or something. Like, it's for a feature that exists that some of you probably haven't heard of. There's very pathetic amounts of actual information being conveyed here, which is probably why you haven't heard about it. Like, great, I decided to give up an estate privilege. I decided to give another estate privilege. I saw this massive list of provinces be conquered. Great, but can I have, like, maybe, if it's a lot of provinces like this, maybe mention them as part of states? Like, mention this conquest of, for example, China, which is what's going on here, not a conquest of Guangdong, Bogju, Jamju, Jansun, Murian. I'm mispronouncing all these names, but you kind of get the picture. What this feature is kind of sad for the promise that this could have been as a little mini chronicle of your achievements to look back to, and then just seeing great. Like, you can tell when I was in a, in a republic as well, and it's just like, oh yeah, by the way, it became a republic here. It's amazing. Granted, I really wasn't doing much conquest, but then you can see in these pacifist periods, literally nothing happens from this ledger as well. Talk about what I'm doing in terms of deving, culture conversion. Like, come on, there's so much potential here. Like, it doesn't even talk about things like building great projects or upgrading them or how I've impacted the economy or what I've done for trade or anything else other than that. You briefly mention wars and that's about it. Frankly, it's a very disappointingly implemented feature. And I think there's so much potential here that it's just not being utilized. I know that it's not being utilized because no one looks at this tab ever, but I think no one looks at this tab ever is because this tab is one of the most boring things to read in the planet. Like, come on, you're reading about the history of the country that you are in charge of. How did they manage to make this boring? And since we're now talking about buttons in the bottom right of our interface, let's talk about the other button, the ledger. Now, the ledger's great. I am a ledger enjoyer. This thing is very useful for getting stats out of your country. There's some pretty useful stuff in here as well that you should probably be using. Religions for example, tracking how many countries specifically are each thing to see who's defender of faith and the buffs you're getting from each defender of faith for the breakpoints, and even a breakdown here. There's a lot of relatively useful stuff and less useful things like score over time. The problem is that all the information here is given in a very utilitarian way, I think is the best way of putting it. So, for example, in the country tab, you see the exact development down to the monarch point of each nation. You see the manpower down to the number of each nation. As far as ledgers go, this isn't the worst one, because it exists, frankly. But let's, for example, consider the Civ 5 ledger. Sure, it presented a lot of useful information as well, but it did so in an almost roleplay way, like literacy rate being a percentage of your nation that has literacy, even though it also means, like, how many texts you've researched. The population metric being, an actual population metric, and so on and so forth. Not just how many pops you have in your country. Like, there's a lot that can be done in the ledger to almost aid roleplay perspectives, in a sense that the information you present can also just be reworked into some kind of like demographic view, almost again from Civ 5, that can be demonstrating it. Now, I don't want to get rid of the information from the ledger, and I think another focus on here is that it needs to be almost on its own other button. So if you don't want to look at the roleplay ledger, you just don't. Like, again, to see population metrics maybe from development, like extrapolate development and population, for example, or like total land area, something that Skanderbeg does, for example, which is no actual relation. It's basically just how big the provinces you have over the world. But that's cool to see, like which country is literally the biggest on the map, even if it doesn't have the most provinces. Things like that could be really cool to implement. And this is a pretty nice segue into the next point. I would like a lot more fun nation statistics. I want to see what the average amount of fort level in my country is if I'm doing something funny like this where I'm spamming forts everywhere. I want to see, on the topic of forts, for example, where most of my battles are fought in terms of like a little heat map of where I fought battles. So I can see, okay, here's where I fought loads of rebels. I can see a little heat map of here's where I tend to get invaded. Here is a heat map of attrition casualties taken by my troops, and attrition casualties taken by enemies invading me, for example, would be really cool multiplayer. A heat map of saying a global casualties taken in the world, so where most people have died, like to see where the big battles have been fighting. I think that'd be really cool, and I just don't see that being implemented because it isn't being implemented. Again, it's a purely roleplay feature. If you don't want to see where the province that suffered the most devastation in the world is, that's up to you. But I think it'd be cool to have as a national summary, and it doesn't have to be negative. So it could be cool things like which province in the world has the most trade power generated, which province in the world generated the most goods, like throughout the existence, in like total goods produced, but overall throughout its existence, like what thing produced the most. And we're not talking value adjusted, even if it's like grain, like what province made the most of a trade good. Province that was taken over the most times, like which province changed hands the most times. And there is like a province history section, sure. But most of the time, I feel like the province history section, which you can find here by the province history section, but I feel like most of the time, the province history section, if it is used to identify when, like, a province like this one, let's say this was owned by something stupid like Spain, you could use it to find, like, oh, it broke to Chahari separatists. Like, if it said this province was occupied by rebels and then instead of being liberated from any occupation was, say, broken by rebels, you can see what happened for the origins of the province. But it's more of a utilitarian view again, where this is basically a history button for a cool feature on the side. I think this is genuinely a very sad letdown of why this isn't a thing. So anyway, I talked about having your generals have history, and by the way, absolutely would love the same thing for admirals as well. I've talked about your rulers, monarchs, getting more history, and the history tab, which is kind of meant to be your nation history, but also your ruler history tab, putting those into one, being expanded. I've touched upon getting more nation statistics and more things in the ledger, but the one thing that I think is a very good thing to add to both help you have a desire to play late game, but also in a weird way do so without adding more features or feature bloat, whatever you want to call it, but a purely roleplay reason to play more later games and even review your own save games, is to really work on the timeline feature. First of all, a lot of the time it is relatively broken. Like, I can see my modern borders on this timeline feature here, which maybe is intentional, but can be a bit jarring and a bit of a spoiler sometimes. So you have to be a bit careful with that. But I think what will be really helpful within the timeline feature itself was to, for example, just have little pop-ups of things happening or major events occurring, for lack of a better word. Like, for example, sure, you can see on the timeline when I take provinces from Ming or something, but if I can select a country of interest, normally it's Korea or something, or select a country of interest for an AI only like France, you can have little pop-ups saying, oh, they got a new monarch on the throne. Oh, they took exploration ideas. Oh, they upgraded their monument, for example. Or they completed a certain mission. Or they took over a certain area. I mean, you can see that on the map when they took over a certain area, but I guess it's more complete a certain mission and they achieved a certain objective. They built that dockhouse in Brest. Maybe not things like built a dockhouse in Brest. Maybe things like major missions get highlighted. I think that would be relatively cool. And of course, for the AI time-lapse enjoyers and other people that make time-lapses, myself included, I made a couple, it should be able to be turned off just so you can see the only borders. But when you're reviewing a game yourself, having like some kind of almost recognition of new monarchs taking office, you becoming a republic instead of staying as a theocracy or whatever, like so much other things like that could be really cool to see, just like as a little pop-up notification. I think that'd be neat. Anyway, that is all I have time for today. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, a big thank you to all the people supporting me over at Ko-Fi, with a special thank you to Arkansas.